My name is Duncan Yukon Williams, and I thank you so much for attending this first panel of a three-part speaker series, Resilience, Recovery, Repair, hosted by May We Gather in collaboration with Tricycle and funded by the Asian Pacific American Religions Research Initiative, or APARI. Um, I'm the director of the Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture at the University of Southern California, as well as a co-organizer of May We Gather. And it's my honor to be moderating today's panel. So just a word for some context. May We Gather is a collaborative project of commemoration and healing by and for Asian American Buddhists and their spiritual friends. In 2021, we organized a national memorial ceremony on the 49th day after the Atlanta SPAR shootings. And this year, to mark the three-year anniversary of the shootings, we're organizing a national Buddhist pilgrimage in Antioch, California on March the 16th, 2024. And you can learn more about the pilgrimage and register for in-person attendance on our May We Gather website. And this pilgrimage will also be live streamed for those who wish to attend virtually. And so building on discussions generated from the 2021 memorial around racial and religious erasure and recovery as they relate to Buddhism, the Resilience, Recovery, and Repair speaker series, we aim to offer some insight into the historical and contemporary contexts that shape this upcoming May We Gather pilgrimage in Antioch, California. And our series brings together community elders and leaders, acclaimed historians, archaeologists, educators, and spiritual teachers together in conversation to reflect on topics as varied as 19th century gender and immigrant experiences, folk religion, spiritual life, and contemporary projects of restoration and repair in California and beyond. And today's panel, Resilience, a story of 19th century Chinese immigrants in Antioch and beyond, features two esteemed speakers, Jeannie Felser and Lucy Meinhardt. And I'll be introducing the two of them just before they give their presentations. Before turning things over to our distinguished speakers today, though, let me share a few visuals to set the stage about why I'm personally also very excited to hear from Jeannie and Lucy today. So, as maybe some of you know, my background around Asian American Buddhism and history connects more to my lineage and cultural background, which is the history of Japanese American Buddhism and what happened during World War II in terms of the incarceration of that community, targeted not just because of their race, but because of their religion. And I wrote a book called American Sutra back in 2019 about that. And one of the images that I came across in my own research in thinking through these kind of historical questions about American Buddhism, Asian American Buddhism, about how race, religion, and American belonging work, was this image from the Free World magazine from World War II, in which the threat to American, not just identity, but maybe even American national security was in some sense jeopardized by the existence of the Japanese American community on the Pacific coast. And the image here is of a samurai, a kind of stereotypical Japanese figure, kind of hiding or kind of behind a Buddha statue, riding on, a tank. Kind of this notion of a kind of military or national security threat to America, with a conflation of people of a certain racial or national origin background with religion. And that kind of fear of an Asian American Buddhist community back in World War II is something that I argue in my work led to the forced removal and unjust incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry. And in thinking about that history, I also sometimes think about the work of people like the speakers who'll be speaking later in this webinar and others later in the series who study Chinese American history. Because before Japanese American Buddhists, the earliest establishment of Buddhism in America comes with the Chinese American or Chinese community presence in Hawaii and then in North America. And in thinking about these questions, I sometimes think about these images like the one on the right of the slide about the yellow peril, this idea that Asian people represent some kind of threat to a certain vision of America. And I think there's this ongoing question that happened not just in World War II, but in the 19th century when Chinese immigrants came to the United States, where one vision of America was one that was multi-ethnic and accepting of people of many different backgrounds and religious faiths. But there's also a different vision of America, which is a little bit more singular and supremacist, in which America is considered a land which is white and Christian. And so, for example, in this Harper's Weekly illustration, you see this image of a land that's illuminated by the Christian cross that is being threatened, looming in the distance, these dark clouds, threatening clouds coming towards this land with the Buddha kind of in the middle of it. And so this idea about who belongs, who doesn't, who is American, who isn't, who legitimately can reside and be included in the notion of America is has a long history and has a particular valence with Asian Americans. And this is the second slide I'm going to show that reflects this period in the 1870s. This is prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, but you can see the rhetoric in these kind of popular illustrations, like in the Harper's Weekly thing from 1870, the idea of building a Chinese wall around the United States of America, this idea of keeping certain peoples out from kind of polluting or somehow threatening the idea of America, and this usage of this slur word, the heathen Chinese, kind of racialized, but also the heathen meaning non-Christian. This idea of a peoples who shouldn't belong in America because of their not just racial inassimilability, but also their religion being unsuitable, and talks about this kind of invasion of these migrants that would potentially, for example, establish a heathen Chinese despotism in San Francisco. This kind of rhetoric being one where race and religion seem to be conflated. And so today, I'm very pleased that we will have a chance to talk about Antioch and why we are holding our May We Gather pilgrimage in that city. It's one where the speakers, I think, will make reference to the year 1876, that period when this kind of rhetoric was really in the air, when the Chinese residents were expelled from that town. A fire was set in the district where the Chinese resided. which, according to some fire maps that Funi Su has found, included a Buddha Taoist temple, a topic that will be taken up in part 2 of our seminar series. But you can see in the reporting of that time, the Sacramento Bee talks about this fire that destroyed the community. They use rhetoric like the Caucasian torch lighted the way of the heathens out of the wilderness. This kind of idea of that fire as somehow being justifiable to creating a certain kind of space. And so this is the backdrop that I wanted to set for, especially those for whom Chinese American history and this kind of Asian American historical background from the 19th century is new, why this topic might be relevant, even if you're not of Asian American background, if you're not Buddhist. We have these kind of larger rhetorics of, is America essentially a white Christian nation, or is it a nation that is of multiplicity of different people, different backgrounds composing it, and a nation of freedom, especially of religious freedom? So these are the type of questions that I wanted to frame our conversation today and ask that our speakers who will be giving some framing as well as very specific content about Antioch, as well as the larger situation of the 19th century around Asian American, especially Chinese American history, will be providing for us. And so with that, let me introduce our first speaker, Jean Felser, who's an internationally recognized scholar and commentator addressing pressing issues of immigration, labor, and women, dedicated to sharing long-buried stories in American history with local, national, and award-winning historiographies, the most recent being California, a Slave State from Yale University Press, 2023. And Driven Out, it's a book that I read and very much appreciated. Driven Out, The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans from the University of California Press, 2007. She's consulted and appeared in PBS, CPBS, and C-SPAN. She's was on the curatorial team for the first Pan-Asian exhibit by the Smithsonian Museum of American History. And has curated exhibits for a number of local history societies and also for the National Women's History Museum. She writes for the Huffington Post, History News Network, and The Globalist. And currently, Jean is working with the Eureka Chinatown Project in Eureka, California, and is a member of the 1882 Project on Rural Chinatowns, consulting with towns on their way to honoring Chinese American history. And so with that, let's turn things over to Jean.
Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you to Maybe Gather, and thank you to Tricycle for hosting me. I think this is a really critical time in American history and American political consciousness for us to be thinking about and talking to each other about what is happening, about the pressures on people, the way exclusion has played out in ways that are through libraries, through teaching, through our kids, and through public discourse, that's rather terrifying. And so I also tonight want to speak to notions of repair and resilience and reparations. My talk tonight comes from pretty much 3 sources. One is from Driven Out, which is the focus of our discussions tonight. And the second is from California, Slave State. And the third is that I had the honor of testifying before the Reparations Commission. And I've been very much thinking about notions of how to repair, how to heal, how to make whole, what are the true meanings of forgiveness, and what are the possibilities for resistance. And with that, I'm going to start. This is a visual ideogram the Chinese word for the expulsions, the over 300 expulsions that happened across the Pacific Northwest, is Pai Hua. And this was drawn for me for the book Driven Out. And everybody looks at these ideograms differently, but with that, the one to the left is pi, which is hand, and people can perhaps even see a hand in the image to push away. And hua has many meanings, but it can also mean not or the other or not ordinary. So I'm calling this talk Repair, and the Chinese called it Pai Hua. So when I was finishing grad school and needed to complete my dissertation, I moved with my 6-year-old daughter into a cabin in the woods in remote Humboldt County up in Northern California, almost at the border with Oregon. And there I began my career as a professor of American Studies. There at Humboldt State University, which is now Cal Poly Humboldt for the last year, nestled in the redwoods between Oregon and the lumber and fishing town of Eureka. In 1974, this rural university had an unusual mix of white and Chinese students. But in my classes, in the hallways, at the nightly peace rallies, at meetings across campus, where Hupa and Yura and Karuk students were demanding that Native American myths and history be included in a sequence called, quote, the American Frontier, I noticed the complete absence of Asian students. Where were the Asian kids? This didn't look like the Los Angeles I was born into and grew up in. When I asked about the missing students, many didn't know, and some had not noticed. But I heard from a local poet that Chinese parents would not send their kids then to Humboldt State because 100 years ago, all the Chinese had been driven from the county. A year later, I left Humboldt State. But then, as now, I was haunted by the Roosevelt elk foraging in the placid lagoons, the light slicing under the fog banks over the Pacific, and the missing Asian students. How to find this untold history of racism that took place in this ethereally beautiful place, where for hundreds of years before the lumber companies arrived, the Yurok called it Okito, there where it is calm. I return each year, but as with other places of great beauty, I was disturbed by the history of violence that I believed was embedded in this landscape. In my mind, the dissonance between the land and its history would not go away. I decided to find the missing Asian students. And on the very first day of my quest, back then, before the technology we have now, I was rolling the cloudy microfilm reader at the Bancroft Library on the Berkeley campus. And there, on the front page of the Alta California newspaper, I quickly discovered that this was a bigger story than what had happened up in Humboldt County. I said to the librarian who was helping me, there goes Seattle, there goes Tacoma, there goes San Jose, Truckee, Fresno, and on and on. This is a map that I made as I began to follow the footsteps of thousands of Chinese people who were violently gathered, loaded onto railroad cars or steamers, forced onto logging rafts, marched out of town or killed from Seattle to Oregon to California to the Rocky Mountains, from the Canadian border down through the arid Central Valley to Los Angeles. This is a placard from Crescent City. For the next 5 years, I traveled to most of these towns. There were over 300 red dots on that map. I knew that because I had to go out and buy little red dots. So for the next 5 years, I traveled to as many of these towns as I could. Some were eager, even relieved to have their story told. County clerks, librarians, local historical societies, open maps and court records, clipping files, leather wallets, private photo collections, scrapbooks, and old safes to expose the purges that had occurred in their counties. But others denied the story I already knew. I was discovering then, as we are discovering this year, firsthand how libraries, so much on our mind now, worked toward exposure or erasure, revelation or repression. What had happened? Initially, Chinese miners who came like hundreds of thousands of others from around the world for gold, for the gold rush, starting in 1849, 1850, 1851, were driven off their river claims by vigilantes. One mob was accompanied by a brass band. California found other ways to remove the Chinese. They passed the foreign miners tax. This was a back-breaking tax copied after a special tax that had already purged Chileans, Argentinians, and Mexicans from the gold field. And it went from $2 to $3 up to $20 a month, something that miners coming from all over the world could not afford. Another way that the Chinese were purged is that they were treated horribly at immigration. The Chinese were searched and the women were strip searched and refused entry, allegedly for bringing opium into the country. Opium was not a Chinese tradition. It was forced upon China by the British, who were looking for something to trade in return for Chinese tea and silk. Chinese women kidnapped and from the port cities of Guangdong and the coast and shipped to San Francisco into forced prostitution were driven out for being lewd. We think about the 1882 Exclusion Act, but we need to remember first came the 1875 Page Act, and that was the act that banned women from entering the United States for being, quote, lewd or debauched. Those were euphemisms for Chinese women. That the Page Act was targeted, the first immigration act, targeted at the Chinese. In Los Angeles, and this is a picture of LA's Chinatown that was called with the N-word alley in 1871. In 1871, 17 Chinese men and one Chinese woman were lynched. One day, I received a phone call from a woman I'd never met. She said, I'm the librarian from the LA County Library. I hear from the grapevine what you're working on. I have something I think you should see. And here comes a rather painful image. This is a picture of the day after the lynching, one of the largest mass lynchings in the United States. And this happened in LA in 1871. These are the bodies that were cut down and tossed into the LA jail yard, waiting for their families to come and claim them and bury them, and hopefully find a Chinese cemetery where they could be buried with the Chinese traditions. And then, as I was doing this research on LA, where I was born, where I never heard any of this, where I went to Holmes Junior High School and Hamilton High School, which were interracial schools with many Japanese and Chinese students. I had never heard any of this. But then I found documents. The Chinese in LA and the merchants in LA had forced the arrest and the trial of the vigilantes, and many were sent to San Quentin. There were other ways. In the 1880s, San Jose's Chinatown was torched to the ground 6 times. 6 times San Jose's Chinatown burned to the ground, and each time they rebuilt. The last time the Chinese rebuilt in brick, so it wouldn't burn down. In Truckee, now turning into kind of a, rather than a lumber town, it's sort of a chic ski town. Truckee was fearful of the lawsuits and the violence, and they decided to do it peacefully. They would starve out the Chinese, mainly the lumber workers who were cutting wood for the new railroad, and the few enslaved prostitutes. And they did it over a period of 10 weeks. When a few Chinese people remained, the whites circled the Chinese part of town. The Chinese had been shoved across the Truckee River. The whites circled their side of the town with fire wagons, invited the white ladies to observe. They sat on the balcony of the hotel, and the vigilantes and the men of Truckee burned Chinatown to the ground. So torching arson was part of this violent tradition. On February 5th, 1885, our story moves to Eureka in Humboldt County. Eureka was and is a lumber town, a fishing town. It's a rural town on the coast. It's about 130 miles south of the Oregon border. And it was the biggest town where I was living up in Humboldt County. On a cold Friday night, shots rang out in Eureka's Chinatown. It was Lunar New Year, and Lunar New Year is just coming up. The Chinese residents had heard that gamblers were coming up to cause trouble, and they asked the police for protection, a right they shared with all other residents of this lumber town. The police refused. But on that cold night, in a melee, a city councilman was shot and killed. Within an hour, 800 people gathered in Centennial Hall, ironically named in honor of the first centennial of the Declaration of Independence. The meeting was chaired by the mayor. There were 3 motions. First, 1, kill all the Chinese, but in that Christian town, it was voted down. Second, burn Chinatown. But in Eureka, the Chinese were not allowed to own property, and Chinatown, the land and the houses, were owned by a white man. The Chinese who were meeting in Centennial Hall weren't about to torch another white man's property. The third motion, purge all the Chinese residents of Eureka, give them 24 hours to get out of town. Vegetable growers, servants, launderers, merchants, ranch hands, prostitutes, nannies, and children. All night long, the terrified residents of Eureka's Chinatown packed as an effigy of a Chinese man hung from the gallows. Vigilantes went out into the woods and tracked down Chinese people who lived at remote ranches and the lumber camps and marched them back to town and down to the wolf. At dawn, the vigilantes and the sheriffs marched the Chinese to a warehouse at the docks, following the wagons that carried whatever property people could manage to pack in that one cold night. Merchants' wives trudged painfully on bound feet. On the waterfront, a group of white women showed up, demanding their laundry. Here, the Chinese spent the weekend, cold, frightened, hungry, and under armed guard. On the Sunday, they were loaded onto 2 ships. The wind came from the north that night, and the ships, to everyone's surprise, arrived in San Francisco on the Monday morning. The custom house, which was then the immigration station, was closed from the weekend, and the Chinese from Eureka fled into San Francisco's Chinatown. That same afternoon, after that terrifying weekend, the Chinese from Eureka regathered, and they invited the press and the mayor. The Chinese council made a historic announcement. Quote, "We intend to seek redress in the courts. Someone will have to pay for the injury done to these refugees." The Chinese, in what I believe to be the first lawsuit for reparations in the United States, sued Eureka for $132,820 for the economic damage done to them, the loss of their homes, their furniture, their businesses, their stuff, their shrimp boats, and most urgently and relevant to today, they were sued for, quote, "being the victims of mob violence." China had just paid America $700,000 after anti-American riots destroyed Christian missions in Canton. Now it was America's turn to pay up. Histories tell us the early Chinese left few footprints, but Wing Hing v. the City of Eureka is the first lawsuit. It is for reparations. It is a historic footprint. Why did this happen? Why did the driven out, the pile cloth purges happen? This was the time of the failure of Reconstruction, the promise of equality from the Civil War. The purges followed two violent paths toward racial purity, converging in the West. And you can see this in the slide, where the Chinese people are moving in, and under guard of a white vigilante, the Native Americans are moving out. And the white people are at risk. Their covered wagon is being rolled off the mountainside. There will be no room, this cartoon alleges, for white people. From the birth of California in 1850, the American military began murdering Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest, what's now called the California Genocide, forcing them off their traditional lands to make way for settlers, white farming, mining, and logging. So there was already, with the expulsions and the torching of Indian villages and the genocide, there was a racial template for ethnic cleansing. And the Chamber of Commerce made a promise. It promised white immigrants, if they came to Humboldt County, that no Chinese person would compete for their labor. Another explanation. After the Civil War, ideas of white purity moved west. Southern Democrats quickly took over California's governor mansion, state legislature, and many county boards. Southern black codes traveled west. As in Herndon, Virginia recently, in California, there was a cubic air code that limited how many Chinese could inhabit one room. This is an image of a laundry on Butte Creek up near Chico. And one of the codes was that you couldn't have a laundry in a wooden building. But of course, everything in Northern California was made out of wood. Another code was that forbade anyone carrying anything on a pole extending past the end of their shoulder was banned. And this was, of course, for people who didn't have wagons or horses, or in small towns and in cities. This was the pole was the way of carrying goods. And then there was the dangerous popularization of Darwin's idea of the survival of the fittest. This is a cartoon like Duncan from Harper's, and it shows a shoddy scientific view of evolution from the monkey through the Chinese person ending up with the pig. In 1880, California banned all interracial marriage. And this is from sheet music. And it depicts the kind of racial overlay of the Uncle Tom caricature marrying the black dandy to an Asian woman who's sort of a mixed metaphor in herself, in what she's wearing. But ironically, despite the danger and mockery of this love, of this wedding, the lyrics do something different. The lyrics celebrate the interracial marriage and invite people to come to, quote, a wedding like no one has ever seen before. This is a child's cap gun. There's one at the Smithsonian. I could have bought one, but they wanted $5,000 for it. And here, an Irishman kicks a Chinese man in the rear, and he pulls on his cue. The Chinese, and particularly the Chinese men, were the target of the era's homophobia. Whites were obsessed with the Chinese man's flowing clothes, his, quote, bachelor society, because mainly it was men who came, and Chinese men chose to come to the United States to mine and later to work for the railroad. And they were obsessed with his long braid because it was different, because it was seen as feminine, because it could be cut off. This cartoon from Harper's Chinese also shows the stereotypes and the homophobia that force these purges or encourage these periods. It's a study of working class. It's called A Picture for Employers. This is not, the figures on the right are not what white working class looked like either. It wasn't that tidy, it wasn't that clean, there wasn't food on the table. But the more dangerous one is the one on the left, of a Chinese opium den with men stoned out on opium with their legs erotically entangled with each other. We're going to talk about this more when we talk about Antioch, but Chinese immigration in the 19th century was very gendered. The men chose to come to California, but the women, except for a very few merchant wives, didn't choose to come. Young girls were kidnapped, strip searched, and sold on the streets on the docks of San Francisco. If they weren't sold, there was a slave den at the edge of Chinatown called the Queen's Room. And actually, I found out more about this for California, slave state. At first, I thought there were no tongs, and I was very wary of using that word, but there was a prostitution tong, the hippie tong that controlled the sale of these Chinese girls. This is a girl in a brothel, a caged brothel. She serviced about 20 men a day, and there was a curtain. A man would come by, she would service the customer. The brothel owner, often a merchant's wife, would take the money and open the curtain, and she would again service another man. But the Chinese fought back. In the 19th century, Chinese Americans organized one of the first general strikes. It was in Shasta County, and they organized the first farm worker strike in California. In early boycotts, the Chinese refused to sell their vegetables, and to anyone who was involved in, quote, an anti-coolie league, and they starved white households and hotels of fresh food. In Amador County, they organized armed militia of over 50 members to protect themselves. Elsewhere, they returned laundry, folded but still dirty. In San Jose, they filed the earliest California lawsuit against police harassment. In the Sierra town of Truckee, I found Chinese receipts for rifles and Colt revolvers. during weeks of violence. The Chinese fought back. In the 1890s, starts in about 1893, red posters pasted on the walls and barns from California to New York, and 110,000 Chinese people, 110,000 Chinese people. That's more just about than the total of people who voted in New Hampshire last night, just saying. 110,000 Chinese people refused to carry police identity cards, now required by the US government to verify their immigration status. California does not have a tradition of internal passports. We don't have to carry our identity with us except our driver's licenses, which now have these coded barcodes on them, and we don't know what's in those coded barcodes. But the first identity cards were targeted for the Chinese. This is a little boy from Hawaii. So there are these two histories, the man's history and the women's history, the free and the enslaved. Young girls kidnapped, sold, kept in cribs or cages in San Francisco. And these are the girls who managed to escape. And they start, I believe, the rural Chinatowns that are spread all across California. In 1906, Chinese cannery workers arrived to work the salmon season on the Eel River. In other words, they came back. But within days, they were rounded up, forced onto boxcars, and kept on Dulawat Island, which has now been returned to the Wiyot tribe. And that was the site of the brutal 1860 Wiyot massacre. But this time, the Chinese refused to leave without a full season's pay. So even though they'd only been on the Eel River for a few weeks, they got 6 months' pay and had to wait for a ship to carry them away. Different countries have recovered lost historic evidence to different effects. In former Yugoslavia, histories of ethnic violence coexist with memories of shared neighborhoods and interethnic marriages. But when the memories of violence were unleashed, the history of community was repressed, and it started more hatred. In Ireland, the telling of ancient grievances still provokes brutality. But tellings, as the Irish call it, knit people together in imagined communities of pain that can exclude and kill again and again. But in South Africa, people staked their hope for reconciliation on the belief that a history of atrocity must be released. If the perpetrators are forced to hear victims' testimony, they will admit what they have done, and national healing can begin. The actors of the roundups in the Pacific Northwest have passed away, and their living memories are no longer with us. With Chinese women banned from the US under the Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, making Chinese immigration impossible, history from descendants who endured the roundups are very few. I thought the memory must be lost. A people on the run don't stop to record violence as it's happening. The Chinese newspapers burned in the fire of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And although the Chinese were banned from testifying in court, we do have a record of a woman, Chui Lau, who established the right, which is being debated now in the Supreme Court, the right under the 14th Amendment for birthright citizenship. If you're born in this country, you have a right to be a citizen. In February 1910, a woman named Wang Yoklin marched up the steps of the courthouse in Sonora and demanded that her deposition be taken. She created her own original legal form. She called it an affidavit. And she states that her husband is in jail. And while he's in jail, men might kidnap her and sell her as a prostitute. Yokleen, 36 years old, born in California, but not allowed to become naturalized, declared, "I am a free woman. No man," she says in this affidavit, "could ever claim me again." I've had the honor of working with the Eureka Chinese Reconciliation Project, and we're 2 years in. This is the design for the project. The city of Eureka has given us a corner of a lot, and the lot faces the part of the sea where the Chinese were deported. There is a tile pathway telling the chronology of arrival, departure, expulsion, but also the return of an Asian American community. And there's a poem by our local poet, brilliant poet Daryl Chin, that talks about how we forget and how we remember. And I'd like to end with Daryl's poem. It's called "The Tiles of On the Ground Go Hope, Gold Mountain, Chinatown, Expulsion, Resistance, Resilience, Return, Community, and Hope." There's a ginkgo tree that you see on the left, an Asian symbol of longevity and resilience, and a magnolia tree that symbolizes purity, and a marker that acknowledges the Wiyot people who lived on this land for thousands of years. Let me end with Daryl Chin's poem called "The Water Book of Questions." And it's about all of us who came here. I'm an immigrant's daughter. What brings you here? Why are you still here? Were you on that boat? Aye. What do you feel when you learn about this? Who are your people? If we all go away, what remains? About that time, what do you say to family? One photograph only. Are you in it? We are newcomers, strangers to the language, the food, the stories. What do we know of being expelled, excluded, turned away, delayed, arrested, threatened, spit on, beat up? People forget. People deny. Does the land forget? Does the land deny? Does the air remember? Do animals and trees pass down memories like horses standing silently next to one another? What is memory? A book not opened? A stone in the rain? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. I know we've probably got questions for Jean, but let's hold off on those or put them into the Q&A function if you wouldn't mind. And we'll now have our second speaker, Lucy Meinhardt, present, and then we'll take all the questions in our Q&A section right after Lucy's presentation. Lucy Meinhardt, or Lucille Meinhardt, is a retired public librarian. She has a BA in biology from Rice University, BS in education from Ohio State University, and MLIS from UC Berkeley. After becoming a volunteer and board member of the Antioch Historical Society Museum, and having led the sesquicentennial history walks in downtown Antioch, including the former Chinatown area, she was one of the three compilers of the Antioch Sesquicentennial Almanac. She's had a very active role on the Antioch Chinese History Planning Project Committee, and she also writes stories for the Museum Gazette newsletter, and she's lived in Antioch for 52 years. And we very much appreciate your joining us, Lucy, and bringing us the vantage point of the history of Antioch. So, Lucy, please.
Thank you, Duncan. And thank you, Jean. I always enjoy listening to you. I learn something every time. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the people of Antioch, California, inhabit the traditional lands of the Hulpun and Ompen bands of Bay Miwok peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations, calling us to commit to be better stewards of the land we inhabit today. Antioch, my town. Antioch has a beautiful location on the coast of the San Joaquin River to the north, in view of Mount Diablo and its foothills to the south. Some say it's a vortex. I'm not so sure, but perhaps. Now there's a series of lovely pictures of Antioch coming up. Bay Miwoks chose our coastal areas for burial grounds, for which European American settlers found ample evidence. We're located at the confluence of the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers that drain melted mountain snow from the lands of California's Central Valley and form an inland river delta with 1,000 miles of waterways. It was a vast floodplain until the construction of a network of levees built for the purpose of gaining farmland. The delta has provided fresh water, fish, and food for its earliest inhabitants and those of today. It is the primary source of drinking water and farm irrigation for the state of California. The 2020 census counted over 111,000 people in Antioch. Among them, 35% are Hispanic, 25% are non-Hispanic white, 20% are Black, 12% are Asian. We are one of the most diverse communities in the Bay Area of California. This is a list of the languages spoken at homes of students in the Antioch Unified School District. There are 44 languages there. The predominant ones are English, of course, about 10,000, and close to 5,000 speak Spanish in their homes. It wasn't always this way. Antioch was not always diverse. When I came to Antioch in 1972, the community was approximately 98% white, of which 12% were of Spanish descent. The population of Pittsburgh, just 5 miles away, was 20% Black. One might ask, why? It is known that before the Civil Rights Act of 1968, Antioch was guilty of racial housing covenants and redlining. During World War II, members of the military were stationed at Camp Stoneman in Pittsburgh before shipping out to the Pacific War Theater. When the war ended, many who enjoyed our weather wanted to stay. Those who were Black could not find housing in Antioch. They settled in Pittsburgh. Recent events in Antioch indicate that we are presently a community in need of healing. 2 years ago, we learned that the FBI was investigating a number of Antioch and Pittsburgh police officers for moral turpitude. According to CBS News last month, nearly 4 dozen Antioch police officers have been implicated in corruption probes involving alleged racist policing, excessive use of force, and fabrication of evidence. A number of officers have been placed on administrative leave. Some have since been charged. Some may be exonerated and return to their jobs. It remains to be seen. Meanwhile, Antioch is very short of officers, while we still have to pay those who are on administrative leave. Before racist texts were discovered, Antioch citizens of color had complained about unreasonable treatment by Antioch police and held demonstrations at the police department building. Such complaints were brushed off as politically motivated. Since then, the city council has instituted reforms of the department. The Antioch police now have body cams. They did not before. Phones are monitored, and the department is subject to community oversight. 7 months after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, Antioch resident Angelo Quinto, a 30-year-old Filipino-American Navy veteran, suffered a mental health crisis. Police who were called restrained him on the ground with their knees. He lost consciousness and died 3 days later. The coroner listed excited delirium as the cause of death. An independent autopsy found that he died of asphyxiation. The officers involved were found to have acted correctly according to the standard policy of California law enforcement and were not charged. However, A new California law that started January 1st this year now prohibits the use of excited delirium as a cause of death. And it was because of Angelo Quinto. And named for Quinto, Antioch now has the Angelo Quinto Community Response Team for mental health crises. And they would be the first responders in this kind of situation. Now, let's go back to when Antioch began. Captain George W. Kimball arrived in Antioch in 1850, along with other families who built a packet ship in Maine with him for the purpose of relocating to California. Though he received his land from a land grant through a previous settler, William Smith, he became the first permanent settler, erecting a house from lumber he brought from Maine. He also built wharves down on the river for receiving coal. The gold rush of 1849 brought numerous European Americans to California. Some chose to settle in Antioch, foregoing the difficulties of the mining life, instead finding ways to make a living from miners and others traveling from San Francisco to Sacramento and Stockton and the gold-rich foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Antioch, located halfway there, boasted deep waters on its shores, and it wasn't long before more wharves and docks were built. It became a bustling stopover with numerous hotels. Antioch received its name, a biblical one, in 1851. It originally supported itself with farming and dairies. Subsequent early industries included a lumber mill, a brickyard, and a distillery. Coal was discovered in the hills to the south. Antioch was a terminus for coal trains from the mines, as was Pittsburgh, bringing heat to many Bay Area homes built from Antioch lumber and bricks. Antioch's first newspaper, the Daily Ledger, was founded in 1870. It continued publication for more than 100 years. The town became the first incorporated city in Contra Costa County on February 6, 1872. People from many countries, including China, were present in Antioch's early years, coming to find work farming, mining, building railroads, and levees. Most Chinese in Antioch lived in one part of town on both sides of First Street, between H and I, and on I between First and Second, comprising Antioch's Chinatown. And there's a little photo of a map that shows that little blue part down there on near the river is where the Chinatown part was. In 1871, a huge fire destroyed many blocks along I Street, then called Main Street, from 2nd to 4th Street. Well, the number 1 is the closest to the river. The fire eventually burned out only after townspeople tore down a building to remove fuel from the moving fire. It was Hop Lee's Laundry on 1st Street. I can read this to you if you can barely see it. It's an ad that was actually in the Antioch Ledger the first year of its publication. And they say Wyatt Street, that's what 2nd Street used to be. Hop Lee would intimate to the people of Antioch, the ladies particularly, that he washes and irons clothes in first-rate style. At his wash house, clothes are not beaten to pieces, nor does he send home linen without sewing on the buttons. Charges low prices. Hopley rebuilt his business on First Street further east between G and H, according to historian Elise Benyon, the great-granddaughter of George Kimball. Yet we know very little about Antioch's early Chinese residents. We know that the first Congregational Church in Antioch, founded in 1865, schooled the children of Chinese levee laborers. The children were not welcomed in the public schools. We know of the resident Ah Young, who grew vegetables west of town, and he sold them to the town's inhabitants. Extra amounts could be shipped down the river, too, to be sold. The fire of 1876 was brought to our attention, since we hadn't really heard about this, just like Jean said, she didn't learn about all these things that had happened years before to Chinese people. It was brought to our attention when in spring 2021, The San Francisco Chronicle released an article about Antiochans threatening its Chinese residents and telling them to leave, then eventually burning down Chinatown. The newspaper article described Antioch as a sundown town with a law from 1851 that prohibited Chinese on the streets after dark, forcing them to create secret tunnels to get to and from work after dark. One version that we also had found information about of the expulsion and fire explains that the precipitating event was when Antioch parents learned from a doctor that their sons had contracted venereal disease, syphilis actually, presumably from Chinese prostitutes. Well, Antioch had both Chinese and white prostitutes. The fathers went to where the prostitutes lived and told them to pack up and leave town. It was said that they packed up and left on a boat upriver to Stockton. Stockton was not welcoming, so they returned to Antioch the next day. Then their houses were burned and they escaped to San Francisco, an even worse place than Stockton for Chinese women to be. As we heard from Jean too, most of the women that came to California from China did not come under their own volition. They comprised a very small number compared to the number of men. And they were brought as prostitutes, some as very young girls sold into prostitution. And Antioch was probably a much safer place than San Francisco. In April 2021, soon after the article was published, Antioch's city council and mayor issued an apology to Antioch's 19th century Chinese and their descendants for the events of 1876, publicly promising to create a Chinese historic district and public artworks commemorating the event. The city would work together with the Antioch Historical Society Museum. In subsequent months, the cities of San Jose, Los Angeles, and San Francisco issued apologies also. The result was the creation of the Antioch Chinese History Planning Project. The museum would choose a consultant with whom they would obtain community input about the best sort of public memorial to the events of 1876. I'm a member of the museum committee. After applications and interviews, Claudia Ocello of Museum Partners Consulting, Maplewood, New Jersey, was the chosen consultant. She traveled here on 3 occasions, each time hosting focus groups of Antioch and Bay Area residents, both Chinese and non-Chinese, who were interested in the project. We took her on tours of Antioch, Antioch's Chinatown area, Locke and Ileton in the Delta, and we went on a special tour of black diamond mines related to when Chinese miners lived in the coal towns. We did research to learn what we could. Some of the research called into question assumptions about a sundown law. Its existence has not been proven, and if it was created in 1851, it would have had to have been a county ordinance. Then the Chinese tunnels. We know there are underground passages in downtown Antioch. Some are concrete, running the length of a block below the places of business above. Some are lined with brick, but we do not know their original purpose or who used them. We do know that the European American residents of Antioch were much like many other Californians in their feelings about the Chinese in their midst at the time. The Chinese, no doubt, suffered racism. And law or no law, local practices realistically likely applied sundown rules. In her final report on the project, Ocello strongly recommended rigorous academic research. She recommended we have a panel of scholars, such as Jean and the scholars of May We Gather, to find the truth to Antioch stories. She concluded that our residents wanted any public project to include a celebration of the contributions of Antioch's resilient Asian community, past and present. If you want to look a little bit on this one that you're seeing, this is one of the things that Claudia recommended, ways that we might present the information we have found so that we can relate what we do know, what must have been so, and what might have been so, and then giving people the information that we have, let them make up their own mind. In May of last year, the Antioch Historical Society Museum hosted an Asian American Pacific Islander symposium featuring 4 speakers, including Gene Balzer. Following the speakers and discussion, Ron Chan of Oakland told the story of his father, Alfred Chan, who grew up in the Cortland area of the Delta, working on a sharecropper farm with his family and attending segregated schools. He served in the Navy as a Seabee in World War II. And I have some photos. There he is as a young Seabee. When he was 15, Alfred and his friends stopped in Antioch in 1939 to get a bite to eat on the way home from a fun day in San Francisco. He and his friend were refused service in an Antioch restaurant because they were Chinese. In fall of 2022, Antioch Mayor Lamar Thorpe made a personal apology to Mr. Chan by presenting him the framed Chinese apology proclamation he had signed in April 2021. Alfred Chan died within 2 months after this happening at age 98. Ron, his son, said his father had closure after 83 years. Ron donated the proclamation to the museum where it is on display. It was a very moving moment and is part of Antioch's healing. And that completes what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And we are running a little bit behind schedule. And so if there is a burning question for our presenters, of course, please send it in the Q&A. But I think we're going to try to wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so, because we want to respect people's time that they're sharing in. Of course, on the East Coast, it's quite a bit later than here on the Pacific coast. And so, I think I wanted to, first of all, thank Jean and Lucy for their presentations. And I think I certainly learned a few more things I didn't know before. And from a Asian American Buddhist vantage point, hearing the two talks, I guess my kind of reflection is one where, I think we as Buddhists tend to think about the world as being interlinked, that we live in a connected world where our actions impact everyone who lives in. We tend to use words like Jewel Net of Indra, or our world that where we are interlinked. And what I got from today's lectures of Jean and Lucy are these ways in which I think, Jean, you pointed out the different interconnections of what happened to Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, that are not disconnected from what happened to Native Americans or happened to African, that these histories are also interlinked between communities. And there's this other idea of time. I think in the Buddhist tradition, we tend to think about karma and different, I think people in our times have been talking about the racial karma of our nation, how certain things and harms that were done in one generation, in one era, in one particular place, whether we like it or not, have reverberations and are interlinked over generations and over times, and that it's all of us who are affected by what happened to our ancestors. And so I was very much appreciating, Jean, your examples and from the 19th century, but Lucy, also yours, that you talked about more recent events and ways in which some of this unresolved history has resonated over time and is connected to our present. And so I think we also got a sense, both Jean, your presentation about the gendered nature of Chinese American history, and the specifics you gave, Lucy, about what happened in Antioch, how we might think that they are not disconnected from the purpose of our pilgrimage, which is a third-year memorial pilgrimage for the Atlanta shooting. And of course, the women were targeted then, and some of those questions about belonging, some of those questions about moral belonging continue to this day. And so I do want to be sort of, if we can bypass any, if there's no questions that are really, really burning, I wanted to just thank our two speakers, very much appreciating their work. And of course, please support the Antioch Historical Society and Lucy's organization. And of course, please learn more about Jean's work in her books, California Slave Slate, and Driven Out: The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans. I think we can put the links to those, the society and her books in the chat window. So with that, I hope we can conclude, and that all of you who joined us today might be able to join us for our next two events in the series. On February 8th, Wednesday, Drs. Chu-Mei Ho, Bennett Bronson, and Jonathan Lee will be our featured speakers for Recovery, the History of America's Early Buddha Taoist Temples, in a conversation moderated by Chenzeng Han. And on Thursday, February 22nd, Corina Gold, Christine Cordero, Devin Berry, and Noliwe Alexander will be our featured speakers for Repair, a Path to Healing Land and Ancestors, in a conversation moderated by Funitsu. So thank you to the two speakers, and for all of you for taking time today, and hope to see you at our next event on the online webinar series on February 8th, and hopefully in person in Antioch in March as well. Thank you so much.